The morning mist clung to the rocky ridge like a stubborn child refusing to let go. Sarah Chen adjusted her medical pack and squinted through the fog at the valley below. 3 days ago, this had been peaceful farmland. Now it looked like the surface of a dead moon. The Zephyrian invasion force had turned the once green fields into a wasteland of scorched earth and twisted metal. Their ships, sleek and predatory, hovered above the ruins of New Geneva like vultures waiting for the last breath of a dying animal. Sarah had seen enough war zones in her 5 years as a combat medic, but nothing quite like this. "Chen, you copy?" The voice crackled through her comm unit. Lieutenant Martinez sounded tired, and Sarah didn't blame him. They'd been running guerrilla operations for 72 hours straight. "Copy, Lieutenant. Still nothing moving down there? Good, keep your head down. Intel says they're bringing in heavy armor today." Sarah shifted her position behind the boulder that had become her observation post. The ridge gave her a perfect view of the valley, but it also made her feel exposed. Every shadow could hide a Zephyrian scout. Every sound could be the last thing she'd ever hear. She wasn't supposed to be here. Combat medics were supposed to stay back with the main force, patching up wounded soldiers and keeping them fighting. But when Captain Rodriguez had asked for volunteers to spot for the artillery teams, Sarah had stepped forward. Someone needed to guide the shells onto target, and someone needed to be ready when the inevitable casualties started piling up. The Zephyrians had caught humanity off guard. Their ships had appeared in Earth's skies 6 months ago, silent and threatening. At first, the alien visitors had seemed peaceful. They'd established communication, speaking through translators about trade and mutual understanding. The politicians had been thrilled. First contact with an alien species and they wanted to be friends. Then the bombs started falling. Sarah remembered watching the news feeds from her apartment in Chicago. Sydney burning. Tokyo reduced to rubble. Moscow disappearing under a cloud of smoke and ash. The Zephyrians weren't interested in trade or friendship. They wanted Earth's resources, and they didn't care about the 8 billion humans who called the planet home. A glint of movement caught her eye. Sarah raised her binoculars and focused on the valley floor. There, emerging from behind the ruins of a farmhouse, came something that made her blood run cold. The Zephyrian walker stood 20 feet tall on 4 articulated legs that moved with mechanical precision. Its torso was a mass of sensors and weapon systems, all focused forward like the head of some enormous predatory insect. Sarah had seen pictures of these things in the intelligence briefings, but seeing one in person was different. The pictures couldn't capture the way it moved, smooth and deadly, or the way its sensors swept back and forth like the eyes of a hunting cat. "Martinez, this is Chen. We've got company." "What kind of company?" "The kind with 4 legs and really big guns." Sarah heard Martinez curse over the comm. "How many?" She swept her binoculars across the valley, counting the telltale signs of movement. Her heart sank as more walkers emerged from concealment. They'd been hiding, waiting for the right moment to move. "I count 12. No, 15. They're heading northwest toward Hill 347. That was where Bravo Company had dug in for the night. 60 good soldiers who didn't know death was walking toward them on metal legs. "Chen, I need you to paint targets for Firebase Alpha. Can you do that?" Sarah looked at the laser designator clipped to her belt. It was a simple device, really. Point it at a target, pull the trigger, and artillery shells would rain down from the sky. She'd used it before, guiding shells onto Zephyrian supply convoys and troop concentrations, but never on anything like this. "Roger that, Lieutenant. Painting targets now." She activated the designator and aimed it at the lead walker. The device hummed softly as it locked onto the target, invisible laser light marking the massive machine for destruction. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. One shot, one chance to take down the leader and throw the formation into chaos. The walker was moving faster now, its sensors focused on the hill where Bravo Company waited. Sarah could see the soldiers moving around their positions, tiny figures against the rocky slope. They'd spotted the enemy, but their small arms would be useless against that armor. "Target acquired," Sarah whispered into her comm. "Fire mission ready." "Shot out," came the reply from Firebase Alpha. Sarah counted the seconds. Artillery shells took time to travel. Time for the enemy to move, time for everything to go wrong. She kept the laser locked on the lead walker, watching it grow larger in her scope. The first shell hit 50 meters to the left, throwing up a geyser of dirt and rock. The walker didn't even slow down. The second shell hit closer, close enough to shower the machine with debris. Still it came on, now moving at full speed toward the hill. Then the third shell found its mark. The explosion was tremendous, a ball of orange fire that lit up the valley like a miniature sun. When the smoke cleared, the lead walker was gone, reduced to scattered pieces of twisted metal. The other walkers stopped, their sensors sweeping frantically for the source of the attack. Sarah was already moving, shifting position to avoid return fire. She knew they'd spotted the ridge by now, knew they'd be coming for her soon. But she'd bought Bravo Company sometime, and sometimes that was all you could do. Her calm crackled to life. "Outstanding shooting, Chen. You got him clean." Sarah smiled grimly as she settled into a new position. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant." But even as she said it, she knew this was bigger than any job. This was about survival, about proving that humanity wouldn't go quietly into the night, about showing these alien invaders that humans fought back, no matter the odds. Below in the valley, the remaining walkers had resumed their advance. Sarah raised her designator again, searching for her next target. The war was far from over, but for now, in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. The ridge fell silent except for the distant rumble of artillery and the steady whisper of wind through the rocks. The Zephyrian return fire came faster than Sarah expected. The ridge exploded around her as plasma bolts turned solid rock into molten slag. She rolled behind a larger boulder just as the air where she'd been lying turned into superheated death. Her ears were ringing, but she could still hear Martinez shouting over the comm. "Chen, report!" "Still breathing?" She called back, checking herself for injuries. A few cuts from flying rock, but nothing serious. "They know where I am now. Get out of there. We'll call in a strike on your position once you're clear." Sarah looked at the valley below. The remaining Zephyrian walkers were spreading out, using the terrain to break up their formation. Smart. They'd learned from the destruction of their leader. But they were still heading toward Hill 347, where Bravo Company waited with nothing but small arms and determination. "Negative, Lieutenant. I can still do damage from here." She leopard crawled to a new position, keeping low as plasma bolts continued to hammer the ridge. The Zephyrians were firing blind now, hoping to suppress her while their walkers closed the distance to Bravo Company. But they'd made a mistake. They'd assumed she was alone. Sarah keyed her comm to a different frequency. "Ghost Team, this is Overwatch. Are you in position?" The reply came immediately, calm and professional. "Roger, Overwatch. We have eyes on 3 targets from the east flank." Ghost Team was something new, an experiment in human adaptability that the Zephyrians hadn't counted on. 4 snipers with modified railguns, weapons that fired tungsten projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. The brass had been skeptical when the engineers proposed them. Railguns were ship weapons, too big and power-hungry for infantry use. But human engineers had a gift for making impossible things work. "Light them up," Sarah said. The railgun shots were almost silent, just a soft crack of displaced air. But the results were spectacular. 3 Zephyrian walkers simply came apart, their armor no match for projectiles moving at 30,000 meters per second. The tungsten rods punched through the alien machines like they were made of paper. Sarah grinned as she watched the surviving walkers mill around in confusion. 11 left and they'd lost their nerve. She could see their sensors sweeping frantically trying to locate the new threat. But Ghost Team was already moving, changing position like they'd been trained to do. "Beautiful work, Ghost Team. Firebase Alpha, are you ready for another fire mission?" "Ready when you are, Chen." Sarah activated her laser designator again, painting targets as fast as she could acquire them. The walkers were trying to retreat now, backing toward the relative safety of the ruined farmhouse where they'd started. But retreat was just another kind of movement, and movement made them vulnerable. Artillery shells began falling like deadly rain. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the valley, kicking up clouds of dirt and debris. Sarah watched 2 more walkers disappear in balls of fire and twisted metal. The Zephyrians were learning what humans had known for centuries. Concentrated firepower could overcome any armor, but the aliens weren't giving up. As Sarah watched, something new emerged from behind the farmhouse ruins. It was bigger than the walkers, a massive vehicle that moved on treads instead of legs. Its main gun was the size of a telephone pole, and it was turning toward the ridge. "Oh, hell," Sarah muttered. The tank's gun fired with a sound like thunder. The plasma bolt missed Sarah by 20 meters, but the heat was enough to singe her eyebrows. The rock where it hit simply ceased to exist, vaporized into its component atoms. "Chen, get out of there now." Martinez's voice was urgent. "That's a heavy assault platform. Your position is compromised. Sarah looked at the tank, then at the remaining walkers that were regrouping behind it. If she ran now, they'd resume their advance on Hill 347. Bravo Company would be slaughtered. Negative, Lieutenant. I'm calling in danger close. Danger close meant artillery fire within 600 meters of friendly forces. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was the only way to stop the Zephyrian advance. Chen, that's too close. You won't survive the blast. Maybe not, Sarah said, painting the tank with her laser designator. But these bastards won't either. The tank fired again, and this time the bolt passed close enough to cook the air in her lungs. Sarah could smell her own singed hair, could feel the heat through her body armor. The next shot would end her, she was sure of it. Shot out, came the voice from Firebase Alpha. Sarah counted seconds again, but this time she wasn't thinking about the artillery. She was thinking about her sister's wedding next month, about the promise she'd made to be maid of honor. She was thinking about her nephew's first birthday party, about the way he laughed when she made funny faces. Simple things, human things, the kinds of memories that made life worth living. The tank's main gun swiveled toward her position. She could see the glow building in its barrel, the telltale sign that it was charging for another shot. This one wouldn't miss. But the artillery shell hit first. The explosion was close enough to lift Sarah off the ground and slam her back down again. Her vision went white, then black, then slowly returned as spots of color dancing at the edges. Blood was running down her face and her left arm hung at an odd angle. But she was alive, the tank was not. It lay on its side, a burning wreck of alien metal and technology. The blast had caught it mid-shot, the explosion of its own weapon adding to the destruction. The remaining walkers were scattered, some destroyed, others damaged and retreating. Chen. Sarah, respond. She fumbled for her comm unit with her good hand. Still here, Lieutenant. Target destroyed. You magnificent crazy woman. Medic is on the way. Sarah laughed, then winced as the movement sent fire through her ribs. I am the medic, remember? She pulled her medical kit around and began treating her own wounds as best she could with one hand. Training took over, the familiar routine of triage and treatment that had kept her sane through 5 years of war. Broken arm, possible concussion, various cuts and burns. Painful but not life-threatening. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of battle from Hill 347. Bravo Company was engaged, but they were fighting from prepared positions against a reduced enemy force. They had a chance now. Sarah looked down at the valley, at the wreckage of alien machines and the scorched earth where plasma bolts had fallen. The Zephyrians had been so confident, so sure of their technological superiority. But they'd made a fundamental mistake. They'd underestimated human stubbornness, the simple refusal to quit when quitting was the logical choice. A movement caught her eye. One of the damaged walkers was still functional, limping away from the battlefield on 3 legs. Its weapons were destroyed, its sensors dark, but it was still moving, still fighting. Sarah raised her laser designator one more time, painting the retreating machine. Firebase Alpha, one more target. We see it, Chen. Shot out. The final shell fell with perfect accuracy, turning the last walker into scrap metal. Sarah let the designator fall from her fingers and lay back against the rocks. The ridge was quiet now, except for the wind and the distant crackle of burning vehicles. She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of victory. 3 hours later, Sarah found herself in a field hospital that hadn't existed that morning. Military efficiency at its finest. Within minutes of the battle ending, medics, engineers, and supply personnel had swarmed over Hill 347 like industrious ants. What had been a bare defensive position was now a bustling forward operating base. Dr. Hassan finished setting her arm and stepped back to admire his work. Clean break, good alignment. You'll be back to full duty in 6 weeks. 6 weeks? Sarah sat up too quickly, sending stars dancing across her vision. Doctor, I can't. You can and you will. Hassan's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been arguing with stubborn patience longer than Sarah had been alive. That concussion alone should have you grounded for a month. Add the broken radius and the 2nd-degree burns and you're lucky I'm not shipping you back to Earth. Sarah looked around the medical tent, watching the controlled chaos of battlefield medicine. Wounded soldiers from Bravo Company lay on cots, most with minor injuries from the final assault. They'd taken the hill, but not without cost. Every victory came with a price. Besides, Hassan continued, cleaning his instruments, you're about to become famous. Word is that General Morrison wants to see you personally. Sarah blinked. General Morrison commanded the entire Terran Defense Force in this sector. She was a combat medic who'd spent most of the war patching bullet holes and setting broken bones. What could a general possibly want with her? Did I do something wrong? Hassan laughed. Quite the opposite. That shot you called in saved Bravo Company, and probably prevented a breakthrough that could have cost us the entire line. The general wants to know how a medic ended up becoming the most effective artillery spotter in the sector. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion outside the tent caught their attention. Through the open flap, she could see soldiers snapping to attention as a small convoy of vehicles approached. The lead vehicle was unmarked, which in her experience meant it was carrying someone very important. General Morrison stepped out of the vehicle, and Sarah immediately understood why the woman commanded such respect. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. Her uniform was rumpled from field conditions, and there was mud on her boots. A soldier's general, not a politician's. Which one of you is Chen? Morrison's voice carried easily across the compound. Sarah tried to stand, but Hassan pushed her back down. The one with the broken arm and the stubborn streak, General. Morrison approached the medical tent with long, purposeful strides. Up close, Sarah could see the exhaustion in the general's eyes, the weight of command that never really went away. But there was something else there too. Curiosity, perhaps even excitement. Medic Chen, Morrison said, settling into a camp chair beside her cot. I've been reading about your morning. Quite a performance. Just doing my job, ma'am. Your job is treating wounded soldiers, not calling in artillery strikes on enemy armor. According to Lieutenant Martinez, you've been operating as a forward observer for the past 3 days. Care to explain how a medic learned to do that? Sarah thought about her answer carefully. Generals didn't ask questions just to make conversation. I cross-trained with the artillery teams during the retreat from New Geneva, ma'am. They were taking casualties and someone needed to know how to operate their equipment. Morrison nodded slowly. Initiative. I like that. But there's more to it, isn't there? You didn't just learn to call in fire missions. You learned to think like a forward observer. That takes time and experience. Sarah glanced at Dr. Hassan, who was doing a poor job of pretending not to listen. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Granted. The Zephyrians fight like machines, General. Precise, logical, efficient. But they don't adapt well to chaos. If you can disrupt their plans, force them to improvise, they make mistakes. Today's attack was supposed to be a coordinated breakthrough. Armor supported by infantry, time to hit our weak point. But when we took out their lead elements, they lost their coordination. Morrison leaned forward. Go on. Humans are good at chaos, ma'am. We've been fighting each other for thousands of years, and we've learned to think on our feet. The Zephyrians are technologically superior, but they're not as flexible as we are. They expect their enemies to behave rationally, and you deliberately behaved irrationally. Sarah smiled. I stayed in an exposed position under heavy fire to call in danger-close artillery on my own position. By Zephyrian standards, that was suicidal. They couldn't predict it because it didn't make logical sense. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. Finally, she spoke. Medic Chen, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. The Zephyrians have been pushing us back for 6 months. We've lost most of our major cities and our fleet is scattered. But in the last 3 weeks, something has changed. Our casualty rates are improving, and we're actually winning tactical engagements. Do you know why? Sarah considered the question. She'd noticed the change too. Subtle things like better coordination between units and more effective use of combined arms. The troops are learning, ma'am. 6 months ago, we were fighting the Zephyrians like they were just another human enemy. Now we're adapting our tactics to their weaknesses. Exactly. And that adaptation is happening because soldiers like you are thinking beyond their assigned roles. You're not just a medic who learned artillery spotting. You're a medic who understood that the battle was bigger than your individual mission. Morrison stood up, pacing in the small space between cots. I've been receiving reports from all across the front. Cooks who've become demolition experts. Engineers who've turned into snipers. Pilots who figured out how to jam Zephyrian communications. The entire army is evolving, becoming something new. Sarah began to understand where this conversation was heading. You want to formalize it? I want to accelerate it. The Zephyrians invaded Earth because they thought we were a typical civilization, predictable, specialized, locked into rigid patterns of behavior. They've never encountered a species that could adapt as quickly as we can. That's our advantage, and I intend to use it. Morrison pulled a tablet from her jacket and handed it to Sarah. The screen showed organizational charts and training schedules, but also something else, a new kind of military unit. Cross-trained and flexible. I'm forming specialized teams, soldiers who can operate outside normal doctrine, people who can think like the enemy but act like humans. I need leaders for these teams, people who've already proven they can adapt and improvise under pressure. Sarah looked at the tablet, then at her cast. General, I'm just a medic. No, you're not. You haven't been just anything for months now. You're a soldier who's learned to see the bigger picture, and that's exactly what I need. Morrison sat down again, her expression serious. This war isn't going to be won by superior technology or larger armies. It's going to be won by superior thinking. The Zephyrians made one critical mistake. They assumed that because they could predict human behavior in general, they could predict any individual human's actions. They were wrong. Sarah thought about the morning's battle, about the decisions she'd made that had seemed obvious at the time but were probably incomprehensible to alien logic, staying in position under fire, calling in artillery on her own location, fighting with broken equipment and improvised tactics. What exactly are you asking me to do, ma'am? Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. I'm asking you to help me teach an entire army how to be human. Outside the tent, the sounds of the forward operating base continued, soldiers working, vehicles moving, the constant background noise of a military force preparing for the next battle. But something had changed. Sarah could feel it in the air, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple survival. The Zephyrians had invaded Earth expecting to fight a predictable enemy. Instead, they were about to face something entirely new, an army that refused to be anything other than utterly, chaotically human. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in what had once been the gymnasium of Jefferson High School, watching 30 soldiers attempt to rewire their brains. The building had survived the initial Zephyrian bombardment, making it perfect for General Morrison's new training program. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. They were literally going back to school to learn how to be human. Sergeant Williams, she called out, explain your solution to the scenario. Williams looked up from his tactical display, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Ma'am, standard doctrine says we should establish a perimeter and call for reinforcement. But the Zephyrians would expect that. So instead, I'm suggesting we abandon the position entirely and attack their supply lines 50 kilometers to the south. Sarah nodded. Why? Because it's stupid, ma'am. Tactically speaking, it makes no sense to abandon a fortified position to attack a target we can't even verify exists. The Zephyrians will assume we're still defending the original position and waste resources attacking an empty hill while we're destroying their logistics network. And if the supply lines aren't where you think they are? Williams grinned. Then we're in the wrong place with insufficient support, fighting an enemy we can't defeat. But at least we'll be doing something they don't expect. Sarah suppressed a smile. 3 weeks ago, Sergeant Williams had been a by-the-book infantry soldier who followed orders without question. Now he was thinking like a guerrilla fighter. And more importantly, he was learning to trust his instincts over regulations. The training program was unlike anything the military had ever attempted. Instead of teaching soldiers what to do, they were teaching them how to think. Each scenario was designed to reward creativity over compliance, adaptation over doctrine. It was messy, chaotic, and completely contrary to centuries of military tradition. It was also working. Corporal Martinez, Sarah continued, moving to the next group. Your solution? Martinez was hunched over a 3-dimensional map display, moving unit markers with the concentration of a chess master. I'm dividing my force into 7 separate groups, ma'am. Each one will attack a different target at the same time. That's dispersing your strength. Military 101 says you concentrate force against the enemy's weak point. Yes, ma'am. But the Zephyrians know Military 101 too. They'll be ready for a concentrated attack. 7 simultaneous strikes means they can't predict where our main effort is because there isn't one. Even if 6 of my groups fail, the 7th will succeed because they won't have reserves positioned to stop it. Sarah studied the map display. Martinez's plan was tactically unsound by every conventional measure. His forces were scattered, his objectives unclear, his command structure deliberately fragmented. By traditional standards, it was a recipe for disaster. By human standards, it was brilliant. Her comm unit buzzed with an incoming message. Priority 1, direct from General Morrison. Sarah stepped away from the training area and activated the secure channel. Chen here, General. Sarah, I need you and your best people at Forward Base Tango immediately. We've got a situation. The tone in Morrison's voice sent ice through Sarah's veins. Forward Base Tango was the last defensive position between the Zephyrian advance and the civilian evacuation zone. If it fell, 50,000 refugees would be trapped with nowhere to run. What's the situation, ma'am? The Zephyrians have brought in something new. Intelligence calls it a siege platform, basically a mobile fortress with enough firepower to level a city. It's moving toward Tango, and our conventional forces can't stop it. Sarah looked at her trainees, still bent over their tactical displays. They'd been training for 2 weeks, learning to think outside the box and trust their unconventional instincts. But this would be their first real test. How long do we have? 18 hours until it reaches firing range. Sarah, I need a miracle. I need someone to do something so unexpected, so impossible, that the Zephyrians won't see it coming. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 50,000 lives settling on her shoulders. When she opened them again, she saw Sergeant Williams looking at her with concern. Everything okay, Instructor? Pack your gear, Sergeant. All of you. We're going to war. The flight to Forward Base Tango took 3 hours in a converted cargo transport. Sarah used the time to brief her team on what little intelligence they had about the siege platform. It was massive, nearly 1 kilometer long and bristling with weapons. Its armor was too thick for conventional weapons, and its shields could deflect orbital bombardment. Worse, it was accompanied by a full battle group of Zephyrian forces. So how do we kill it? Asked Private Jackson, the youngest member of the team. Sarah looked at the tactical display showing the siege platform's approach route. We don't. The team stared at her in confusion. Williams spoke first. Ma'am, if we can't destroy it with weapons, Sarah corrected. But there are other ways to stop a fortress. She highlighted a point on the map, a narrow valley that the siege platform would have to pass through. The Zephyrians chose this route because it's the most direct path to Forward Base Tango. It's also the most logical choice. Hard terrain on both sides, good fields of fire for their escorts. Perfect for a siege platform. And perfect for an ambush, Martinez added. No, the Zephyrians will be expecting an ambush. They'll have scouts, air cover, the works. We're not going to fight them at all. Sarah zoomed in on the valley, highlighting specific features. This pass is only 1,500 meters wide at its narrowest point. The siege platform is 800 meters across. That doesn't leave much room for maneuvering. Jackson studied the map. You want to block the pass? I want to move it. The silence that followed was broken only by the drone of the transport's engines. Finally, Williams spoke. Ma'am, with respect, you can't move a mountain. Sarah smiled. No, Sergeant, but you can move a valley. For the next hour, she outlined her plan. It was insane, impossible, and completely contrary to every principle of military engineering. It required precise timing, enormous amounts of explosives, and a level of geological knowledge that none of them possessed. It was also the most human thing she could imagine. By the time they reached Forward Base Tango, the team was buzzing with nervous energy. They had 16 hours to accomplish something that should have taken weeks of preparation. But as Sarah looked at their faces, she saw something that filled her with hope. They believed it could work. General Morrison met them at the landing pad, her expression grim. Please tell me you have good news. I have a plan, General. It's going to require every engineer you can spare, plus mining equipment and about 10 tons of high explosives. Morrison raised an eyebrow. What exactly are you planning to do? Sarah pulled up her tactical display, showing the valley and the siege platform's approach route. We're going to change the geography, ma'am. The Zephyrians have spent weeks planning this attack based on detailed maps of the terrain. But what if the terrain changes? Morrison studied the display, her expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. You want to collapse the valley walls. Not collapse them, ma'am. Reshape them. Create a new path that leads exactly where we want the siege platform to go. Which is? Sarah highlighted a point on the map, a deep gorge 20 kilometers to the east, into the Mariana Valley. It's 3,000 meters deep and 100 meters wide. Even a siege platform can't fly. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the plan from every angle. Finally, she looked up at Sarah with something approaching awe. You realize this is completely insane? Yes, ma'am. It violates every principle of military engineering. Yes, ma'am. The timing has to be perfect or it won't work at all. Yes, ma'am. Morrison smiled. Then let's get started. We have a valley to move. As the general walked away to coordinate resources, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. Sergeant Williams was grinning at her with the expression of a man who just realized he was about to attempt the impossible. Ma'am, can I ask you something? What is it, Sergeant? Do you really think this will work? Sarah looked at the tactical display, at the impossible plan that depended on precise coordination and flawless execution. She thought about the Zephyrians in their siege platform, confident in their technological superiority and logical planning. I think, Sergeant, that we're about to find out what happens when humans stop playing by the rules. The mining equipment arrived at midnight, rumbling through the darkness like mechanical dinosaurs. Sarah stood in the command post, watching the feeds from dozens of cameras as engineers and explosives experts swarmed over the valley like worker bees with a deadline. 15 hours to reshape a landscape that had taken millions of years to form. Sector 7 reports charges placed and armed, came a voice over the comm. Sector 3 is ready for detonation. Sequence. Engineering Team Alpha needs another 20 minutes on the primary support. Structure. Sarah monitored the reports while studying her tablet, which showed the siege platform's steady approach. The massive Zephyrian fortress was making good time, exactly as predicted. Their scouts had confirmed the route through the valley, and their battle group was deploying in standard formation. Everything was proceeding according to their plan, which was exactly what Sarah was counting on. Colonel Barnes, she called to the chief engineer, a weathered woman who looked like she'd been building things longer than Sarah had been alive. How are we doing on timeline? Barnes wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of mud across her skin. It's going to be close. The rock formations are more complex than we expected. We might need another 2 hours. We don't have 2 hours. The siege platform will reach the valley entrance in 14 hours, and we need the charges ready before their advanced scouts arrive. Then we cut corners, Barnes said grimly. Reduce the safety margins. Skip some of the secondary calculations. It increases the risk of uncontrolled collapse, but it's the only way to meet your timeline. Sarah thought about 50,000 refugees sleeping in evacuation camps, unaware that their lives depended on precise geological engineering. Do it. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of coordinated chaos. Engineers worked by floodlight, placing charges in carefully calculated positions along the valley walls. The explosives specialists ran cables through rock crevices, creating a network of destruction that would trigger in precise sequence. Mining equipment carved new channels in the stone, preparing escape routes for the massive amounts of debris that would soon be falling. Sarah found herself thinking about her geology classes in college, concepts she'd barely understood at the time, but which now seemed critically important. Angle of repose, structural integrity, the way rock formations responded to sudden stress. She was gambling with physics on a scale that made her morning on the ridge seem like a minor skirmish. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams approached, his uniform dirty from helping with the cable runs. Zephyrian scouts have been spotted 15 kilometers out. They're moving fast. Sarah checked her chronometer. Right on schedule. The aliens were nothing if not punctual. All teams, this is command. Zephyrian advance elements inbound. Begin withdrawal to safe positions. The valley floor erupted in controlled movement as human personnel retreated to predetermined locations. Years of military training took over, turning potential chaos into organized efficiency. Within 30 minutes, the valley was empty except for thousands of hidden explosive charges and enough cable to wire a small city. Detonation control. Report status. All charges armed and ready, ma'am. 47 primary points, 63 secondary. Sequential firing pattern locked in. Sarah looked at the tactical display showing the siege platform's approach. The massive fortress was visible now even to ground observers, a dark shadow against the morning sky that blocked out the sun. Its escort vessels moved in perfect formation around it, sweeping the terrain ahead for any sign of human forces. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. First scout elements entering the valley, reported the observation post, Sarah. Watched the feeds from hidden cameras as Zephyrian reconnaissance drones swept through the pass. Their sensors probed every shadow, every possible hiding place for human soldiers. The aliens were thorough, professional, exactly as predictable as she'd hoped. Scout teams report all clear. Main force is beginning entry. The siege platform moved slowly, its massive bulk requiring careful navigation through the narrow valley. Sarah could see the stress points on the rock walls where the fortress's repulsor fields pushed against the stone. The Zephyrians had calculated the safe margins perfectly, allowing just enough clearance to prevent accidental damage to their formation. They had not calculated for intentional damage. Half the battle group is in the valley, Williams reported. Siege platform is at the 60% mark. Sarah studied the tactical display, watching the fortress move into the perfect position. Too far in to retreat quickly, not far enough to escape the collapse zone. The Zephyrians had committed themselves to the path just as she'd known they would. All stations, this is command. Prepare for Operation Avalanche. The comm channels fell silent except for the steady reports from observation posts tracking the siege platform's progress. Sarah felt the familiar calm that came before action, the moment when planning gave way to execution and hope became reality or disaster. 75%. 80%. The siege platform was exactly where it needed to be, centered in the valley with nowhere to run. Its escorts were bunched up around it, their formation compressed by the terrain into a target-rich environment. 85% mark. Execute, Sarah said quietly. The first charges detonated high on the eastern wall, sending tons of rock cascading into the valley. But this wasn't random destruction. Each explosion was precisely timed and positioned to create a chain reaction, a carefully orchestrated collapse that would reshape the entire geological structure. The siege platform's shields flared as debris hammered against them, but the aliens weren't concerned yet. Their fortress could withstand much worse than falling rocks. Sarah watched their formation hold steady, commanders confident in their armor and technology. Then the second wave of charges fired. These explosions were deeper, targeting the structural foundations that held the valley walls in place. Ancient rock formations, stable for millions of years, suddenly found their support systems gone. What followed wasn't just a landslide, it was a controlled geological event. The eastern wall didn't just collapse. It folded, massive stone slabs rotating like the pages of an enormous book. The sound was indescribable, a roar that seemed to come from the planet itself. Sarah felt it in her bones, in her teeth, a vibration that spoke of forces beyond human comprehension. But humans had unleashed those forces. Western charges firing, came the report. The opposite wall began its own transformation. Stone flowing like water as millions of years of geological pressure found new outlets. The valley wasn't collapsing. It was changing, reshaping itself according to human design rather than natural law. The siege platform finally began to move, its commanders realizing they were in mortal danger. But the fortress was too massive, too committed to its course. It began to turn, repulsor fields straining against the sudden avalanche of stone, but momentum and physics worked against it. Third sequence firing. The final charges were the key to the entire operation. Instead of bringing down more rock, they opened new channels, creating a path of least resistance that led exactly where Sarah wanted it to go. The collapsing valley walls found the easiest route for their debris, flowing like a stone river toward the southeast, toward the Mariana Valley. The siege platform fought against the flow, its engines screaming as they tried to maintain position. For a moment, Sarah thought the plan might fail. The fortress was incredibly powerful, its technology beyond anything humans could build. If it could resist the geological forces they'd unleashed, then the platform's shields failed. Overloaded by the constant barrage of debris, the energy barriers that protected the fortress simply gave out. Tons of rock began hammering against the platform's armor, each impact adding to the inexorable force pushing it toward the gorge. "It's working," Williams breathed. Sarah watched the tactical display as the siege platform. The pride of the Zephyrian fleet was carried along by forces it couldn't resist. The fortress tumbled end over end, its weapons firing uselessly into the stone flow that surrounded it. Its escort vessels tried to help, but they were caught in the same geological avalanche, swept along like leaves in a hurricane. The Mariana Valley was 3,000 meters deep and 100 meters wide. Even with repulsor technology, nothing could survive that fall. "Platform is over the edge," reported the observation post. "Confirmed impact. No signs of survivors." The comm channels erupted in cheers, but Sarah felt only exhaustion. They'd done the impossible. Turned physics itself into a weapon against an enemy that had seemed invincible. But the casualty report, she called. No human casualties, ma'am. All personnel accounted for. Sarah blinked in surprise. They'd moved a mountain, destroyed the most powerful weapon in the Zephyrian arsenal, and somehow everyone had survived. It seemed too good to be true. Ma'am, Williams said quietly. We did it. We actually did it. Sarah looked at the tactical display at the new geography they'd created. The valley was gone, replaced by a debris field that would take years to clear. But 50,000 civilians were safe, and the Zephyrian advance had been stopped cold. Yes, Sergeant, we did it. But even as she said the words, Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The siege platform had been destroyed, but the war was far from over. 6 months after the siege platform's destruction, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the TDF Resilience, watching Earth grow larger in the viewport. It looked different than she remembered. Fewer lights, more scars from orbital bombardment, vast patches where cities had once stood. But it was healing, and more importantly, it was free. The Zephyrian withdrawal had begun 3 weeks after the Valley operation. At first, it seemed like a tactical redeployment, but intelligence reports suggested something more fundamental was happening. The aliens were abandoning their forward positions, pulling back to defensive perimeters around their primary bases. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity was advancing instead of retreating. Quite a view, said a familiar voice behind her. Sarah turned to see General Morrison approaching, her uniform bearing the insignia of Supreme Allied Commander. The promotion had come with Earth's liberation, recognition of the woman who'd transformed a defeated army into a force that could drive out the invaders. It's good to be home, General. Morrison joined her at the viewport, studying the planet below. The reconstruction estimates are encouraging. Most of the major cities will be rebuilt within 5 years. The agricultural zones are already producing again. And the Zephyrians? Holed up in 3 heavily fortified positions. They're not attacking anymore, but they're not leaving either. It's become a siege situation, but with the roles reversed. Sarah nodded. The reports had been filtering down through command channels for weeks. The aliens had withdrawn to their strongest positions and were apparently waiting for something. Reinforcements, perhaps, or new orders from their homeworlds. That's why I wanted to talk to you, Morrison continued. We've been monitoring their communications and something interesting has come up. They've been sending detailed reports about human tactical capabilities back to their high command. Specifically, they've been trying to understand what happened at the Valley. Sarah raised an eyebrow. They still don't get it? That's just the thing, they do get it. Too well, in fact. They've analyzed every aspect of the operation, from the explosive placement to the geological calculations. They understand exactly how we moved that mountain. Then what's the problem? Morrison smiled, but there was something unsettling about the expression. The problem is that they've concluded it's impossible. According to their analysis, what we did at the Valley violates several fundamental principles of military logistics and engineering. The timeline was too short, the resources insufficient, the risk factors unacceptable. Sarah stared at the general. But we did it. They saw it happen. Yes. And that's what has them confused. They can't reconcile the evidence of their own sensors with their understanding of what's possible. Some of their reports suggest they believe we have access to technology they don't understand. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They think we're more advanced than they are. Not more advanced. More unpredictable. They came here expecting to fight a typical civilization, one that would follow logical patterns, make rational decisions, operate within established parameters. Instead, they found humans. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a translated Zephyrian report. The text was clinical, precise, but she could sense the confusion underlying the formal language. Listen to this. Morrison read. Human tactical doctrine appears to be based on systematic violation of established military principles. Individual units display unprecedented autonomy in decision-making. Standard predictive models are insufficient to project human responses to battlefield conditions. Sarah laughed despite herself. They're trying to analyze chaos. Exactly. And it's driving them crazy. They've spent months trying to develop countermeasures for tactics that don't actually exist. They're preparing for logical responses to situations where humans will probably do something completely unexpected. Morrison put the tablet away and turned back to the viewport. Which brings me to why I wanted to talk to you. The Joint Chiefs are planning the final offensive against the remaining Zephyrian positions. It's going to require every unconventional trick we can think of. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. You want me to plan something impossible again? I want you to do what you do best. Think like a human in a situation where thinking like a human makes no sense at all. Before Sarah could respond, her comm unit buzzed with an incoming priority message. The sender was listed as unknown, but the encryption signature identified it as coming from one of the Zephyrian strongholds. Morrison frowned. That's not possible. Their communications are all encrypted with quantum keys we can't break. Sarah activated the message and text began scrolling across her display. But it wasn't in Zephyrian script. It was in perfect English. Commander Chen, the message began, we have monitored your tactical innovations with considerable interest. We request direct communication to discuss terms of mutual understanding. Sarah looked at Morrison, who was reading over her shoulder with an expression of amazement. They want to talk? To you specifically, Morrison said. They're addressing you by name and rank. Sarah scrolled through the rest of the message. It was formal, almost diplomatic in tone, but the underlying request was clear. The Zephyrians wanted to meet with a human who destroyed their siege platform to understand how she'd accomplished the impossible. This could be a trap, Sarah said. Could be. But it could also be an opportunity. They're clearly struggling to understand human tactics. Maybe we can use that confusion to end this war without having to dig them out of their fortresses. Sarah thought about the thousands of soldiers who would die in a direct assault on the Zephyrian positions. The aliens were beaten but not destroyed. Cornered animals with advanced weapons and nothing left to lose. A negotiated settlement might save lives on both sides. If I do this, I want my team with me. Williams, Martinez, the others. They've earned the right to see how this ends. Morrison nodded. Done. I'll set up the meeting through diplomatic channels. But Sarah, the general's expression grew serious. Be careful. We still don't really understand what the Zephyrians want from Earth. This could be a genuine attempt at communication, or it could be something else entirely. Sarah looked out at Earth, at the planet that had survived invasion and occupation through sheer human stubbornness. Cities destroyed and rebuilt, armies scattered and reformed, millions of people who'd refused to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. General, I've been thinking about something. The Zephyrians invaded Earth because they thought we were predictable. They've been trying to defeat us using logical tactics against an illogical enemy. But what if that's exactly why they can't understand us? I'm not following. What if the reason we keep surprising them isn't because we're unpredictable, but because we're consistently human? What if there's actually a pattern to our behavior, but it's a pattern that only makes sense if you understand what humanity really is? Morrison studied her carefully. And what is humanity, in your opinion? Sarah smiled, thinking of medics who became artillery spotters, of engineers who moved mountains, of an entire species that had looked at impossible odds and decided to fight anyway. We're the species that doesn't know when to quit, General. We're the ones who see a problem that can't be solved and decide to solve it anyway. The Zephyrians keep trying to predict our next move, but they're asking the wrong question. Which is, they're asking what we'll do next. They should be asking what we'll refuse to accept. Sarah turned back to the viewport, watching Earth rotate slowly in the void. Somewhere down there, in hidden bunkers and makeshift command posts, humans were planning the impossible, not because they had to, not because it made sense, but because that's what humans did. The Zephyrians wanted to understand how she'd destroyed their siege platform. Sarah was looking forward to explaining it to them. Not the technical details or the tactical innovations, but the simple truth that had made it all possible. Sometimes, the most human thing you could do was refuse to behave like anything other than human. The war was almost over, and for the first time since it began, Sarah was curious to see what would happen next.